nastavku Ekskluzivno za CD govori Jeffrey Nice, svjetsko ugledno pravničko ime, tužilac, advokat, sudija, osoba koja nije dovršila proces protiv Miloševića u Mromu. Jeffrey Nice i Nena Tromp, pravnici, poslali su jedno pismo na 3 adrese u našoj zemlji prije donošenja odluke o reviziji. Jedna od adresa bio je FACE. Sada, poštovani gledalci, pažljivo slušajte Nice-a i pročitajte pažljivo šta piše u prijevodu u titlu. Taj razgovor je snimljen. Odgovore na pitanja šta zna i misli o sadržaju i kvaliteti aplikacije koju piše David Šefer. Ko je David Šefer? Šta zna o njemu? Da li će se Nice uključiti u pravnički tim? Zašto mu Izetbegović nije dao da se uključi u tim prije podnošenja revizije, odnosno aplikacije? Da li je ovo politika ili pravo? Kakve su šanse za reviziju na sudu? Hoće li aplikacija biti odbijena i koliko će proces trajati? Da li par godina, koliko je sinoć kazala Vasvije Vidović u CD-u? I nešto vrlo važno. Da li sud i države vode pravne bitke isključivo samo politički i birokratski i da li uopšte u samom pravnom procesu ima mjesta za ljudski, humani odnos prema žrtvama i njihovim porodicama? Ovo je veoma važno pitanje, najvažnije. Da li se zaista tužimo samo zbog papira i politike ili zbog ljudi, žrtava istine? Ako države i sud cijeloj reviziji priđu samo i isključivo kao pravnom, papirnatom, birokratskom, proceduralnom slučaju, onda presuda ništa ne vrijedi, ma kakva bila.
What is your knowledge about this potential new evidence and what is your general view of our revision process in front of ICJ?
All I can ask is that a political decision was made honestly and that this is not a case of the president being forced late in the day by reason of public opinion to do something that he had hoped never to have to do. So far as the announced decision is concerned, I'm only too pleased, of course, if they have got evidence and can proceed satisfactorily. But everything about this has been kept secret, and in particular, the first draft provided by the American Sheffer, which I heard towards the end of last year, everything about this draft has been kept secret, so nobody actually knows what's in it. And for my part, I find it a little hard to understand how anything in the closing arguments of the Mladic case could constitute appropriate evidence for the purposes of revision. But let's hope for the best.
Last night we heard from President Izetbegović that the evidences and everything will be publicly known late next week when Mr. Softic files this revision application in The Hague at the ICJ. Do you think that we can win this process at the ICJ in The Hague if we have those documents which they claim at the moment that they have?
As I don't know what the documents are, I can't possibly express an opinion. I think it's going to be extremely difficult. And I think the whole approach that has apparently been pursued by the agent Sakib Softic and his very small team, very recently formed, is not necessarily the right one for Bosnia. I think it's important to recognize that the very restrictive rules of the ICJ for revision are simply not appropriate, in my view, for a determination under the Genocide Convention, and that Bosnia ought to have been, and still ought to be, willing really to challenge those restrictions, to say to the court, your duty is actually not to your rules, but it is to the people who are interested, in this case, the state of Bosnia and its citizens, and you've got to make your rules adaptable to the real circumstances. And if the court did that, and I proposed in a written advice, or not an advice, a written expression of opinion that I've made available to the public through, I think, your press, through your television company and one or two other media outlets, if they took my view on things, then nearly all the evidence additional to what was relied on in 2007 could be and should be available to Bosnia for revision, not just whatever happens to have been touched on in the closing speeches of counsel in the Mladic trial.
We also have that constant confusion here and talk about the documents from Supreme Council of Serbia, and you have stated so many times in public and in document which you have sent to us that Serbian side through Minister Najic and Hague side ICTY through Ms. Del Ponte have covered those documents. Do you believe that this team could somehow came with this documents and go on with this case and bring them in the case now?
Again, I don't know what's in their draft application. Their approach might suggest that they won't be seeking to rely on those documents, because although the documents were obscured in large part at the time of the Milosevic trial, those documents became available for public view in the course of the Perisic trial, and the somewhat simplistic approach by Mr. Softic and his team might say that that is now too long ago for use in revision. But those documents are extremely interesting for a number of reasons. For your viewers, if they don't know about them, they had the precise words of what Milosevic said at the Material Times. It's quite clear that Serbia did not produce all of the records. In particular, it didn't produce the records at all for meetings in 1995, shortly before the Srebrenica part of the mass killings that happened in your country. It's also worthy of note that in the process of getting the documents for our use, I explained very clearly to the Serbian lawyer Vladimir Đerić that there was no basis in law for obscuring them at all, and there was no basis in law. That's actually beyond doubt. And it was at that stage that they realized that their better course was to try and seek a political arrangement with the then prosecutor Del Ponte, and they got her agreement. And that led to those documents being obscured from the public, and then the obscured version being used by the ICJ. Worse was to follow in that other similarly important documents were obscured on the same basis, which had no foundation in law. And your viewers will probably want to be reminded or to know that an entirely different organization from yours, an NGO called the Institute of War and Peace Reporting, many years ago approached Svilanovic, the minister in Belgrade, and he said, yes, what we did in relation to those documents was done to keep them from the ICJ, to keep them from the decision-making body about which revision is now being sought.
Ms. Fadila Memišević, who's chairman of Foundation Pravda for Bosnia, and Ms. Vasvija Vidović, who was part of that first team for a case in front of ICJ, last night have said on a FACE TV that they believe that you and Professor Francis Boyle, who was Bosnia's first agent at the ICJ, should be included in this team, and the team should be much broader than it's now, and bring all that knowledge in. Do you believe that in the next phases of this process, this team would be willing to cooperate with you and your colleague Nena Trump and Professor Boyle?
Well, I can't say what they're likely to do. I can only tell you the recent history. Dr. Trump and I have for 9 years been willing to talk about this subject, not because we're particularly devoted to Bosnia, but simply because we, as a matter of professional experience, or with professional experience and with professional opinions, we think what happened seemed to have been wrong. And we've always said this is something that could be reviewed or should be attempted at any event. And we were engaged a little bit more professionally towards the end of last year in somewhat unusual circumstances, but we offered to do anything we could to help. But that apparently wasn't enough for the president, and whatever it was he wanted, he certainly didn't want it from us, and indeed he forbade Mr. Softic, the agent, from concluding any agreement with us. So we could never technically either do any drafting for the president, or in a sense, we could barely advise him. And it seemed whatever was happening was very curious. There was a draft being prepared by an American, or possibly by an agency of America and through the man, Professor David Sheffer, who is, I think, not a lawyer, but I'm not sure. And then this was a document that would never be shown to me, although they somehow wanted something from it. So what we decided was that all we could do was let our thoughts be known, which is what we've done in the, 23 to others, and hope that those ideas would percolate through to whatever legal team decides to appoint. Whether any of those ideas are now being adopted in the draft that is now apparently being prepared, I can't say. And whether whether the president's going to change his mind about allowing anybody to deal with me on a formal basis, I don't know. It's all very strange, and all I can say is that Dr. Trump and I have at all times only really been concerned to see something that looks wrong to us being reconsidered. And we're only too happy to give our advice and to deploy our professional skills if properly retained by a client, which in this case would have to be the state of Bosnia and the president. It's up to him. We remain willing. He apparently remains uninterested.
Here in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have so many misconceptions about this entire case. Some are saying that the new evidences must be brought in the last 6 months. Some are saying, no, that can be old evidence, but we just knew about it. And people here in Bosnia are expecting that the case will be brought in very quickly at the ICJ. But Mrs. Vasilija Vidovic last night says that she expects that it's going to be years and years of legal procedures at the ICJ. And you know how those institutions work because you had large experience at ICTY. What is really happening here now on in this process?
And I simply don't know the answer to this, but if there's a tiny piece of evidence that is new and falls within the 6-month rule, and as Professor Softic interprets it, that allows them to reopen the issue of the state of knowledge of Serbia on a particular day in July of 1995, I don't mean this too dismissively, but frankly, so what? Is that really what's going to serve any purpose? And I then come back to what I said earlier about the approach to procedure generally. It's my view that there's an argument to be made about the 6-month rule to the following effect, namely that Bosnia couldn't possibly, the state of Bosnia, through its president, through its legal advisors, couldn't possibly decide upon what evidence is really sufficient to trigger a revision or to allow a revision to be triggered until it had looked at either much or all of the evidence occurring in a long period of time since 2007, or not occurring since then, coming to light since 2007. Looking at it as a whole and sitting back and saying, well, what do these bits of evidence, for example, about the role of Bosnian Serb officers paid by Belgrade, look at all the evidence that's come to light and say, well, now in whatever the year might be, let's say 2015, if they actually started the process seriously, then they say, now we look at all this evidence which has come to light, which wasn't available to the team in 2007, we can say, yes, that should trigger a revision. And similar exercises could have been done with evidence about other issues going to show Serbia's involvement, whether it would be through, for example, the Scorpions, showing that they were indeed an organ of the state. It seems to me that there is insufficient courage, from all I've heard, in Mr. Softic's team, insufficient courage so far as challenging the court, the ICJ, is concerned. And the way to challenge them is by saying, these are the realities facing Bosnia. These are actually the shortcomings in your 2007 judgment. This is the way your rules could be correctly interpreted. And if they were interpreted in this way, then all the evidence going to show the true history of Serbia's involvement in the mass atrocities committed in Bosnia could be explored. And then you say to the court, and what's more, we're going to ask you to make that possible because that's your duty. Your duty is not to a narrow interpretation of rules that shut people out. In the modern age, your duty is to victims. Victims are too easily disregarded, actually. It's a terrible thing to say, but it's true. They're too easily disregarded by states when states have an interest of their own to serve, and they can also be too easily disregarded by courts when courts think they have in some way their own rules, their own dignity, their own procedures to put first.